Hello everyone, welcome to another Synth Ratings video. Today we are taking a look at Largo from Waldorf. This is a software adaptation of a hardware synth called the Blofeld. Though they're not exactly the same, they have a similar architecture, and I'm told that the sound is quite similar. Largo and the Blofeld are both developed by Waldorf, the German developers famous for their wavetable synths, and this is no exception. It's a VST plugin with virtual analog or wavetable oscillators, and it was released in 2009. List price today is 156 euros. So let's see if that price is still reasonable for such an old plugin or not. So here's what the plugin looks like. It is logically laid out with the three oscillators on the left side, mixing into the two filters on the right side, and at the bottom there is a tabbed section with the unison, equalizer, LFOs, envelopes, mod matrix, arpeggiator, and the effect section. And at the very bottom we have an on-screen keyboard and the multi-layer controls where you can add different parts together to create a more complex sound. Starting with the sound sources, we have three oscillators, two sub-oscillators, a ring modulator, and a noise source. Oscillator 1 and 2 are wavetable oscillators, so they can play the basic 4 waveforms, but they can also play different wavetables. So let's select one and just scroll down to the first wave in the wavetable. There are some modulation controls here, which are hardwired to frequency modulation and waveform selection. So let's try modulating the waveform with LFO1. And what you can hear is the LFO1 moving through the different waves of the wavetable, creating different sounds. There's also a sub-oscillator. Just reset this. I think I can control click it. Yeah, that's great. Sub-oscillator. I think that's a square wave. You can set 1 octave down, 2, 3, or 4 octaves down with this one. There's also a brilliance control, which controls the brightness of the oscillator. I don't know if you can hear this, but it gets a bit brighter. Now duller. I'm sure you can hear that. You can set the phase to free or from 0 to 360 degrees. And there's a limit button here to limit the upper end of the wavetable. If you are modulating the wavetable outside the scope, this button will limit it. So if I put this to max and set this really high, this button will limit how high it goes. You can hear the difference. All right, reset this again. And the second oscillator works exactly the same as the first. We can select different waveforms. And yeah. The second oscillator works identically to the first one. Only difference is that we have a sync button here, so you can sync the pitch of oscillator 2 from oscillator 3. If I enable that and turn oscillator 3 down, we're just listening to oscillator 3. We enable, no, 2, sorry, and we enable this. It just changes the timbre of the oscillator, but not the actual pitch. So that's the oscillator sync function right there. The third oscillator can only select from the 4 simple waveforms: pulse, saw, triangle, and sine. So there's no wavetables here at all. I wish I could still hear it though. Let's enable it. There it is. So the wave in this instance will just control the pulse width of the pulse wave. If I select a different waveform, it does nothing. Alright, finally there is a control down here to pitch modulate all of the oscillators. You can set it to LFO1, for example. So that works for oscillator 3, and also oscillator 1 and 2. In the mixer, we also have some interesting things going on. You can put the ring mod on. That will probably be easier to hear if I change the pitch of one of these. Let's turn this down. That's the ring modulator you hear. And finally, there is a noise source here. And the contour changes the color of the noise. That's it for the sound sources. Rating the sound sources, we have 3 oscillators and a noise source available for us, and 2 sub-oscillators as well, along with a good selection of combination tricks between oscillators like ring modulation, oscillator sync, and frequency modulation. So there's no doubt that you have the palette available to make a broad range of sounds with this thing. Also, it's worth noting that the wavetables are in fact Waldorf quality wavetables. Some of them are fetched from famous hardware synths like the PPG or the Waldorf Wave, so the quality is definitely there. On the downside, we have no wavetable option for the third oscillator, so that is a bit disappointing. The other thing is that you can't edit or import any wavetables. You're stuck with the ones that come with the plugin. The Blofeld, the hardware version of this synth, has an optional expansion board for this, so why is it not included in the software, I wonder? The sound sources section in Largo gets a rating of 7. Moving on to the filters, we have 2 identical resonant filters. Let's try to get a little bit more interest in the sound that's fed into the filter. Okay. So there's 10 different filter types: normal, low pass, band pass, high pass, notch, and comb. And 8 different distortion types. There's an envelope and velocity control. Notice how you can control the filter by dragging in this display as well, which is cool. I have to say the filters are really intense here. There are some dials to modulate them. You have a frequency modulation here, which is pretty cool. Let's set it to oscillator 3, for example. Probably easier to hear with a normal filter. That's the oscillator 3 modulating the filter cutoff. So this is something that really adds to the amount of possibilities that you have with the filter. There are 2 filters. You can send different sound sources into different filters. Let's say I put oscillator 2 into filter 2, and pan it a little bit to the right, this one to the left. You can clearly hear that there are separate filters going on for the different oscillators. You can also modulate the panning if you want to create some more movement. And control the level of the filters as well. There are a couple of more controls that you should know about. One of them is the bass boost button. Can you hear that? Let's bring one of the oscillators down a little bit. So that's a significant boost to the bass frequencies. This makes the synth pretty useful for bass sounds, actually. Just this one control. There's a parallel or serial switch here that lets you change between the routings of the filters. So that's pretty much it for the filter section, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. So, rating the filter section in Largo, we have a decent selection of filter types and distortion types available to us. We have several routing options, which makes the filter section flexible, and we have the ability to pan filters from side to side, helping create a wide stereo field. The filters sound excellent on this thing, and the filter drive in particular makes the filters really come alive, so you'll be happy with these filters, I'm sure. Filter FM is a nice option to have as well. You can create some wild effects on the filter by modulating its frequency with, for example, an oscillator or something else that has an audio rate. On the downside, we can always wish for more filter types. There are no exotic filters available, just the standard ones. So something could be better there, but all in all, the filter section gets a whopping 8 points. Let's init the synth and take a look at the modulation options. We have, first of all, velocity, which you can use to set the velocity response of the volume or the filters or anything else in the modulation matrix. Adjustable here for the amp and here for the filters. You also have aftertouch, which is a control that is sent if you press harder down on the keys while you're playing a sound. But let's take a look at the three LFOs, which we have here. We have 6 different wave shapes. I especially like random and sample and hold. You can set different phases here. You can get them to track depending on the note that you are playing. You can set up a delay so it doesn't start. And you can also set up a fade in. Also, see how the display here changes as you move the controls, which is a very helpful visual guide to what you're doing. Okay, let's set up oscillator 1 with some wavetable and set it to wave 0 and set LFO 1 to modulate the wave. No fade, perhaps. Maybe easier with a square wave. You can sync this to the key or to some clock speed. There's a menu here to set the most common ones, but note that if you start turning this dial, it can go completely crazy. See, we have 7/32 notes, that's normal, right? Or 11/16 notes. These timings are crazy. So I usually use the menu, but if you are feeling experimental, then this is a cool thing to try as well. So that's how the LFOs work. The third one is a little bit special because it has a different waveform than the others called step, and that really transforms the LFO into a step sequencer of sorts. So let's try LFO 3 here instead. So you can adjust each of these steps to the value that you want. And you can also control the step count here. So let's say I just want 9 steps or 7 steps. So LFO3 has some special tricks up its sleeve. You can of course also sync this to clock or fade it in. No, you can't fade it in. But you can sync it to clock. Not 28 bars, but say a quarter note. Maybe it's easier to hear it on the filter. You can get some Morse sounding sounds here. Alright, that's it for the LFOs. Let's look at the envelopes. We have 4 of them. One of them is called filter envelope and goes to the filter. Another one is the amplifier envelope, which of course controls the volume. And an interesting thing here is that even though you have the normal attack, decay, sustain, release knobs, you can actually change the mode. They don't have to be ADSR only, which are the normal kinds of envelopes, which we see in every synth. We have here some additional modes as well. For example, the more complex ADS1 DS2R, which has a lot more stages to it. This might be nice for some extra fine control of the envelopes. You can choose to trigger the envelopes per key or just once. Moving on to the modulation matrix itself, it has 16 different mod slots, 1 to 16 here, with a selection of 38 sources and 58 destinations. At the bottom, we have 4 modifiers, which are mathematical operators. You can take 2 different components. Say I want to take our step LFO3 and do something, let's say the maximum, with a constant of 11. That is called modifier 1. So I route this to pitch, for example, and give it some strength. So yeah, you can go completely crazy with this. It's a very flexible system. It's worth noting that you have several dedicated modulation slots in the different sections of the synth themselves. We have, for example, in the oscillator section, we have hardwired FM controls and wave controls. You can still choose the modulation source, but the destination is fixed. So that's very helpful. You don't have to set them up in the modulation matrix to use them. Same in the filter section, you have FM, cutoff, etc. Looking at the modulation options, we have a few positives here, like the fact that we can use the LFO3 as a step sequencer, and that the sample and hold LFO shape can be used as a random number generator, generating a new random number every time you press down on a key. The envelopes are also very flexible. You're not stuck with the normal ADSR envelopes, but you have several different options, and the envelopes also feel quite snappy and fast, so that's good. You have dedicated mod slots for the most important parameters. You don't have to dive into the modulation matrix just to set up an LFO to the filter frequency cutoff, for example. That makes things a little bit faster and easier to set up. And you have 4 mathematical operators in the mod matrix, which in my opinion more than make up for the lack of scalable mod matrix slots. In fact, they are a lot more flexible. So you can go crazy with those. On the downside, the modulation can't change waveforms or other menu items, and more importantly, you have no ability to modulate effect settings. So that's a disappointment. Another disappointment, perhaps, especially for you keyboard players out there, is that this is, as a software adaptation of a hardware synth, a very playable instrument. But the fact that you don't have different velocity curves may put some people off. Finally, the modulation range just feels a little bit weird. When you turn up a modifier, nothing seems to happen at first, and then when you get around halfway, everything happens at once. It almost feels like it's sort of an exponential scale and not a linear one. That just takes a little bit of getting used to. Largo gets a 6 in the modulation options department. The effects section is where you find 2 different effects engines with 6 different effects types. We have chorus, flanger, phaser, overdrive, delay, and reverb. So let's just disable this stupid pitch modulation for a second and take a listen to the effects. So if I turn on the chorus, it gives a nice little chorus effect. I can choose between the stages, increase speed and depth, stereo spread, delay, and feedback. So it's nothing too fancy, but it can help turn some sounds into better ones. We have flanger as well, with a few controls. The phaser. Not too easy to hear it, it's quite subtle. The overdrive. You can hear that I can't really change parameters here in real time because the sound stutters, which is annoying. Yeah, it's not too bad. The delay effect is in fact my favorite. Again, you can select it from the timing from a menu to get a sensible value. Let's put some modulation on it and some stereo spread. That's quite a wonky reverb. I like it. You can also turn this dial again to get some seriously stupid timings, like 31 128 notes. That's probably going to be really useful, but you can get quite creative with this, and I have to say the results of this delay section is really nice. Finally, we have the reverb, so let's enable that. There's not a lot of controls for the reverb. There's no algorithm selection, so you can't choose a room or a hall, for example. But there are a couple of controls here to dampen the highs or cut them out, and increase the decay, the density, pre-delay, etc. So it's decent, but nothing I would probably use a lot of in proper production. Looking at the effects section, it's hard to find any big positives. I guess the delay is the best of the onboard effects. It's got lots of weird timings, and the sound quality is good, so you can play around with this and get good results. On the downside, there are only 2 engines and no alternative routings, so you have to stick with the serial one. There are few effects algorithms available, and not a lot of configuration options for the ones you do have. You don't have different reverb algorithms, for example, and some of the effects are just quite weak, like the overdrive, for example. So you'll probably be using a lot of external effects for this one. All in all, the effects section gets 5 points. So let's talk a little bit about the ease of use here. You can see the interface. It is logically laid out. Things are easy to find. It is a bit small because this is made for an old resolution called 1024 x 768 pixels, which we don't really use in our computer displays anymore. There is a manual. You have to download it separately, and it's really excellent, but unfortunately you can't find it by clicking somewhere in the user interface. You have to keep it on your drive and open it manually when you need it. There is a MIDI map here, which means you can control different dials in the plugin from your MIDI controller, but unfortunately it's all hardwired, so you have to look that up in the manual to find which controls do what. You can't right-click and MIDI learn something to set whatever controller you want to whatever destination you want, and you can't obviously make your own custom maps for those controllers either. So that's a bit of a shame. but there it is. There's a separate screen for preset management. I'm in the init bank right now with a lot of exciting init programs. You can open up different banks, the factory sound set, for example, and select different presets here. You can select by keyboard, which is nice. And yeah, the plugin usually handles changes to waveforms, etc., without any zipper noises or loud outbursts. If I keep this pressed and then change to a different wave, nothing really pops out or destroys the sound in any way. Same thing if I choose different effects. There's a little bit going on here, but nothing to worry about. Looking at the ease of use category here, the graphical user interface is logically laid out and easy to understand. The activation of the plugin is easy, and the presets can be changed from the computer keyboard, which is always a big plus. There are touchable displays that visualize waveforms, filters, envelopes, LFOs, and the EQ, meaning that you can see what's going on as you turn knobs, but you can also actually modify the settings in the display itself. On the downside, you can't increase the GUI size, and some controls are beginning to get very small. The arpeggiator pattern creation and LFO 3-step editing is a bit fiddly, and you have to work a little to get that the way you want it. You're stuck with a hardwired mapping of MIDI controls. You can't set up MIDI learn or route several controllers to one dial, for example, here. So that's a bit of a negative. Sound layering, okay, it's good to have the option, but it's a hassle to set up. It's probably just easier to layer in the DAW itself. It's much quicker. The downside then is, of course, that you can't save your layers as patches within the instrument itself. So I wish this was a little bit easier. Also, patch management in general, okay, you have a separate browser, but it's hard to get really friendly with it, I think. The rating for ease of use here is a 6. So maybe we should take a listen to some of the presets. There are quite a lot of presets bundled with the synth. The factory bank has 128 presets in it. Some of the other banks have a lot less though, and you have to expand each folder to get them, which is kind of annoying. You see here, this bank, for example, has only 28 presets, so it would perhaps be friendlier to the user if they just bundled them up into bigger banks and perhaps didn't pay too much attention to the creator here, just post-fixing the name with the initials of the creator or something. So yeah, that's what you get in terms of presets. We have 821 of them included in this version, which is a good amount. The variation is also good. There will be something here for most people, and the third-party support is also pretty good, with new banks actually still coming out almost 10 years after the synth was released. So you can find patches out there for sure. As is the case for many plugins, the presets don't really showcase the full power of the synth. Check out some of the third-party demos if you want to get a bit closer to what you can do with this thing. Also, few presets utilize the sound layering capabilities. That might be because it's just so darn hard to set up. Presets feel a little bit quiet. It is quite easy to overdrive and distort internally, so that may be why they are opted to stay on the safe side instead. And finally, they really missed out here because the plugin can't read Blofeld presets. The architectures are very similar, and there are quite a few presets out there for the Blofeld, so it would be really nice to be able to read those. All in all, the presets get a rating of 7. Let's talk a little bit more about the other features of the synth that we have. We have 256 voice polyphony down here. There's no menu, but you can set it to, okay, I want 238. That's cool. You have 6 voice unison over here, which is very nice. Detune and spread controls. So you can hear the unison. Quite fat unison, which is nice. As I said in the beginning, we have 4 different parts here. The problem is that you can't really do too much about them. I can copy a part into a different part, like this. But I can't save a part and load. Let's say I wanted to load a single part preset into this part here. I can't. It's not possible, unfortunately. So that means that the multi-part functionality here is a bit lacking, I would say. Even though you can use it to, for example, make the unison go way higher. Now I have in practice an 18 voice unison here. There are multiple outputs, one for each part, or a stereo pair for each part. But if I wanted to use that, I'd probably just use more instances than one, because there's no functionality here to set a keyboard range for each part. For example, I can't have a bass part playing down here and an ARP playing up here. It's not possible. So I'm sticking to layered sounds here and using the stereo output. Here we have a preset that uses 2 parts. Yeah, so you can create some cool multi-layered sound with this, but it will take a little bit of work. Moving on, let's go back to the init patch again. We have an arpeggiator, which you can enable. So you have different types of patterns here, and some shuffle. So the arpeggiator is not something that you can use to press one key and it will play a preset melody for you. It is a chord arpeggiator, which means that it spreads out all the notes of the chord you're playing. Let's say I'm playing a chord, and enabling the arpeggiator will spread those chord notes out according to different patterns. So there's a screen here to create a user pattern. You can, for example, enable some ties and offset some timings. And also there's a shuffle dial here. You can set up different octave ranges. It's a bit much. There are quite a lot of options here for setting up that kind of arpeggio. I'll try to find some presets. Yeah, so the arpeggiator is quite basic, but functional. You can also set up legato or glide. So let's try the init patch again with some glide on it. That's a bit much. You can also put it in stepped mode to make it less smooth. That's kind of cool. So finally, there's the 4-band equalizer. Enable that. And you have a low band, 2 mid bands, and a high band. You can put minus to plus 20 dBs on the gain here. There you go. Same thing for the mid bands, of course. In this case, you can't actually drag them around, which you can in most other displays in this synth. Yeah, the EQ is a nice addition, no doubt about that. Rating the other features of the synth, we have a decent arpeggiator for spacing out chords. It's not like a melodic arpeggiator where you just press one key and a defined melody comes out. You have layering capabilities. You can save multi-layered sounds in presets if you can be bothered to set them up. The unison gives you a nice detuned stereo spread, and it doesn't cost a lot of CPU either, as we'll see. There's a separate EQ section, which is always nice, especially when you don't have too many effects engines available. We have some negatives here as well. The built-in arpeggiator patterns are not visualized, so you have to check the manual if you want to see how those look. However, the user pattern is visualized, which is, I guess, the most important thing. You can't save or load arpeggiator patterns, so if you have actually bothered to spend a lot of time setting up your patterns, you can't save them and reuse them. There are no audio inputs, and that is a real shame considering the strength of the filter section. I would love to route whatever I wanted into that section, but you just can't. The scoring for the features category is a 6. Let's put Largo through the CPU efficiency tests. We have one monophonic instance playing here, and the DSP meter in Reaper shows only a 0.03% CPU usage on our system. However, the memory usage is quite high at 146 megabytes, so you have to be aware of that, especially if you don't have too much memory. Our 16 gigabyte system could only take 83 instances before it crashed, so I doubt that very many of you will be using that many instances, but it is something to be aware of. If we add as much effects as we can, that is 2 engines, one of them used for reverb, our simple patch still keeps going, and it only takes a 0.0% extra CPU hit. So the effects are not using up much CPU here at all. Moving on to the complex patch, in this case 3 oscillators, plenty of modulation, but still no effects or unison, we use quite a bit more power at 0.58%. Adding effects to our complex patch means we can get a few instances less, but as we saw before, the effects aren't using all that much power in Largo. 0.8% is enough to get you 125 instances in an ideal world, if you don't run out of memory first, of course. Piling on the unison, 6 voices of it, makes almost no difference to the CPU draw here, which is a huge bonus. Finally, our selection of factory patches shows that the plugin holds up well when used for everyday sounds at 0.3%. That means over 300 instances could be played if you had enough memory. So we have a very impressive score on the CPU test. However, we have this memory usage problem, so although that might be unlikely to be a big problem in the real world, it's still enough to shave a point or two off the final score of 8. The overall results for Largo. The sounds produced are of good quality with a meaty low end and good clarity as well. If you run a lot of instances, the memory usage can cause problems, but how many instances of this do you really need? You get instant results, especially if you invest in some third-party sound banks, but you can also go deep and design your own stuff here. One thing to note is that the sounds can distort internally quite easily, especially when cranking up that filter drive, and the effects section isn't all that, so you'll probably want to apply external effects most of the time. The key thing here though is that tweaking those filters will put a smile on your face because they're really good. The overall score for this category is a 7. As mentioned in the intro, this plugin costs 156 euros, and that's quite high considering the age of the plugin. There are no bundles available either, but there are occasional sales, and we've seen it at 50% off. There's a 1-month demo available, so you can take a look at the plugin and see for yourself what you think. But you'll probably need some sort of special interest in this plugin to pick it up at full price after all these years. Although there's no doubt it is still a very good plugin. The rating for value for money is a 5. When all the categories are done, this is what it looks like. We see that the strengths here are the filters and the CPU usage, while the value for money and effects sections are the biggest weaknesses. The final score for Largo is 6.5, and that qualifies for a recommendation of good. Our closing comments for Largo is that it's best at the bases. It has a powerful low end, which makes it very well suited for those kinds of sounds. But in fact, it's good at all kinds of all-round keyboard sounds. It feels like a proper keyboard player synth, and that's maybe not so strange because it is an adaptation of a hardware synth. I think if you like playing keys, you'll enjoy this. It doesn't do anything badly, but if you are doing lots of effects-heavy stuff like ambient or psytrance or other genres where effects play a huge role, then you can still use Largo, but you're going to have to invest in some external effects as well. Alright, that's all we have for today. If you agree with us or disagree, then feel free to leave comments below. Also, leave comments if you have some suggestions about synths you want us to look at. And remember to subscribe so you get updates when we release our new videos.